Okay, so you want to own an offshore oil rig. You picture it towering out of the ocean, a steel city standing against the horizon, floodlights burning through the night. A symbol of raw industrial power that prints money every time a barrel comes up from the seabed. That's the picture. Here's the number that breaks it. By 2020, more than $30 billion of offshore drilling debt was sitting on the edge of default, and four of the largest rig owners on Earth. Companies that between them owned or operated hundreds of these machines had filed for bankruptcy protection within a few years of each other. Owning the rig wasn't the problem. Paying for it during the years nobody wanted to rent it was. Here's what nobody tells you going in. An offshore oil rig doesn't make money by pulling oil out of the ground. Almost none of these rigs are owned by oil companies at all. They're owned by specialized drilling contractors who build the rig, staff it, and then rent it out to oil majors and national oil companies for a daily fee called a day rate. The rig owner never touches the oil, never sees the crude, never collects a cent tied to what's actually found beneath the seabed. The entire business model is closer to leasing an extremely expensive, extremely specialized piece of construction equipment. Except the equipment costs as much as a small country's infrastructure budget, and the rental market it depends on swings harder than almost any other asset class in heavy industry. We're going inside the real economics of offshore oil rig ownership. We'll build it, staff it, rent it out, and then look at what happens when the renters stop calling. First, understand what you're actually buying, because an oil rig covers an enormous range of machines. A jackup rig, which extends legs down to the seafloor and works in shallow water, is the cheapest and simplest version, useful mainly for exploratory wells close to shore. A semi-submersible or a drill ship, built to float and hold position over water thousands of feet deep, using dynamic positioning thrusters instead of anchors, is a different order of machine entirely. A self-propelled, ocean-going drilling factory capable of operating in some of the most hostile environments on the planet, holding station within a few feet of a target for months at a time, while punching a well miles beneath the seabed. That range shows up brutally in the price tag. A basic jackup rig for shallow water exploratory work can be built for as little as $20 million. Push into serious deepwater territory. The drill ships and harsh environment semi-submersibles capable of working in the Gulf of Mexico, offshore Brazil, or the North Sea. And construction costs run past $500 million, with the most advanced ultra-deepwater units built in the last 15 years costing over $1 billion. The Deepwater Horizon, the rig that would later become the most famous drilling vessel in the world for tragic reasons, cost roughly $350 million to build in 2001. Replacing an equivalent vessel today would cost well over double that. And that number, whatever it lands on, is just the entry fee. It doesn't include a single day of operation. Once the rig exists, it needs a live-aboard crew, and offshore drilling crews are not small. A modern deepwater rig typically carries somewhere in the range of 100 to 150 people at any given time, split across drilling operations, engineering, maintenance, catering, medical and safety roles, working rotating shifts around the clock because drilling doesn't stop for nightfall or weekends. Every one of those people has to be transported to and from the rig by helicopter or crew boat, housed, fed, and paid at a premium for offshore hazard work. And that transport and logistics bill alone, before a single salary is counted, is a permanent operating cost that never goes away regardless of whether the rig is actively drilling or sitting idle waiting for its next contract. And idle time is where the economics get genuinely brutal, because unlike almost any other capital asset, an offshore rig's entire revenue model depends on a single number that the owner does not control: the day rate. When oil prices are high and exploration budgets are flush, oil majors compete for a limited supply of available rigs. And day rates for advanced deepwater units can climb past $500,000, with the full operational spread, including support vessels, helicopters, and specialized services, pushing the all-in daily cost of running a drilling program past $1 million a day. During the boom years of $100 oil, some of the most advanced drill ships in the world commanded contracts north of $600,000 a day. And a rig under a multi-year contract at that rate was, on paper, an extraordinarily lucrative asset. Then the market turns, and it turns fast. When oil prices collapse, exploration budgets get slashed within months. And the same drilling contractors who spent the boom years ordering new ultra-deepwater rigs from shipyards suddenly find themselves with a fleet nobody wants to rent. Day rates for that same class of vessel can fall by more than half in a single downturn. Industry data has tracked average deepwater day rates, dropping from the $500,000 to $600,000 range, down toward roughly $300,000 during periods of oversupply. And at the bottom of a severe downturn, some rigs sit stacked, meaning cold and idle with a skeleton crew, earning nothing at all while still costing money simply to maintain in a seaworthy state. That maintenance cost during idle periods is not trivial. A stacked rig still needs its hull inspected, its systems periodically run to prevent corrosion and equipment failure, and its safety certifications kept current. Easily running into hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, even while producing zero revenue. Insurance is its own permanent, non-negotiable cost layer, and offshore drilling insurance is a genuinely specialized, expensive category, covering not just physical damage to a billion-dollar asset sitting in open ocean, but the catastrophic liability exposure of a well-controlled incident, a category of risk that the industry learned, in the most expensive way imaginable, has essentially no practical ceiling. Layer on top of all of that the eventual cost of decommissioning, because a rig doesn't get to simply retire quietly. Regulators require operators to remove structures, plug wells, and restore the seabed once a platform reaches the end of its working life. And even for the more modest fixed platforms in shallower Gulf of Mexico waters, government cost-tracking data puts average removal costs above $5 million per structure, with costs climbing sharply for larger installations in deeper water. For a true deepwater floater or drill ship, industry estimates for full decommissioning, plugging associated wells, and site restoration can run into the tens of millions of dollars. A bill that has to be planned for and reserved against for decades before it's ever actually paid. And one that doesn't disappear just because the rig sits stacked and unprofitable for years at a time. So before a single well has been drilled under a single contract, before a single day rate check has cleared, the owner of a serious offshore drilling rig is carrying a fixed asset worth hundreds of millions to over $1 billion. A live aboard crew of over 100 people who need to be paid whether the rig is working or not. Insurance and maintenance costs that continue regardless of contract status. And a decommissioning liability sitting on the balance sheet for the entire life of the asset. All of that against a revenue model built entirely on a day rate that the owner does not set. That swings by 50% or more depending on a global commodity, price the owner has zero control over. And that can evaporate to nearly zero the moment oil majors decide to pause their exploration budgets. That's the cost side of the ledger, and on its own, it's one of the most punishing capital structures in modern heavy industry. But it raises the obvious question every rig owner's finance team eventually has to answer. With day rates this volatile, is there any way to actually make this business durable? Start with how the revenue side is actually supposed to work, because on paper it's a genuinely elegant business model. A drilling contractor builds a rig, signs a multi-year contract with an oil major locking in a day rate before the vessel is even finished, and then collects that fixed daily fee for years, regardless of what the rig actually finds beneath the seabed. It's closer to a leasing business than an exploration business, and during the years when a long-term contract is in place, it can be remarkably stable. The problem is that almost nobody in this industry manages to keep every rig under contract at all times. And the gap between a fully contracted fleet and a partially idle one is where offshore drilling economics actually live or die. The number that matters most here is utilization, the percentage of a fleet's available days that are actually earning a day rate as opposed to sitting stacked in transit or undergoing maintenance between contracts. During the boom years, fleet-wide utilization for advanced deepwater rigs can run comfortably above 80 or 90%. And at that level, With day rates in the $500,000 to $600,000 range, a single rig can generate well over $150 million a year in gross revenue. That's the number that gets quoted to investors and justifies ordering another billion-dollar drillship from the shipyard. But recent industry tracking has shown offshore rig utilization dipping into the 70s or lower during periods of reduced exploration spending. And every percentage point below full utilization is pure revenue that simply doesn't exist, while the underlying costs, crew, insurance, maintenance, debt service, keep running whether the rig is earning or not. That mismatch is compounded by a structural feature of the industry that makes it uniquely exposed to boom-bust cycles. The multi-year lag between deciding to build a rig and actually having it available to rent. A drillship ordered during a boom, when oil is expensive and every oil major wants more drilling capacity, takes several years to design, finance, and construct. By the time it's actually delivered and ready to earn a day rate, the market that justified building it in the first place may have completely turned over. This is exactly what happened heading into the 2014 to 2016 downturn and again during the pandemic-driven collapse. A wave of new, highly capable rigs hit the water at precisely the moment oil majors were slashing exploration budgets, flooding an already shrinking market with supply nobody needed, and driving day rates down across the entire industry at once. The consequence of that mismatch is what actually happened to the drilling contractors who own this equipment. By 2020, more than $30 billion of offshore drilling debt was sitting at risk of default across the industry, and companies including Diamond Offshore, Noble Corporation, and Valaris all filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy within roughly the same 18-month window. Seadrill, one of the largest and most modern deepwater fleets in the world, filed for bankruptcy twice within about 4 years, first in 2017, restructuring roughly $2.4 billion of unsecured bond debt, and again in 2021, when the company equitized close to $5 billion of secured bank debt across more than 100 affiliated entities. This wasn't one poorly managed company. It was the dominant pattern across an entire sector built on borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars per rig against a revenue stream that could evaporate within a single price cycle. Here's the part that makes offshore drilling different from almost every other capital-intensive industry, and it's the risk that ultimately dwarfs every other line item on the balance sheet. Well-controlled risk, and its most catastrophic expression, is a blowout. In April 2010, the Deepwater Horizon, a rig that had cost roughly $350 million to build and was under contract to BP at around $500,000 a day, suffered an uncontrolled blowout while completing a well in the Gulf of Mexico. 11 crew members died in the explosion and fire that followed, and the well continued releasing oil into the Gulf for 84 days before it was finally capped, in what became the largest oil spill in United States waters. The rig itself sank within 2 days, a $350 million asset destroyed in under 48 hours. The financial aftermath is the single most important number in this entire industry to understand, because it recalibrates every other cost discussed so far. BP's own reported charges for the disaster reached roughly $62 billion, covering spill response, cleanup, containment, a relief well, natural resource damages, economic claims from Gulf Coast businesses, and a federal Clean Water Act settlement. One academic study that traced every direct and indirect cost, including securities litigation, credit costs, and reputational damage not captured on BP's own income statement, put the ultimate all-in cost of the disaster at closer to $145 billion. Regulatory frameworks in place at the time actually capped certain categories of liability, like damages beyond direct cleanup, at figures as low as $75 million. A limit that Congress had set decades earlier, and that turned out to be almost meaningless in practice, because cleanup costs themselves carry no such cap. And the political and legal pressure following a disaster of that scale made the statutory limit irrelevant. Transocean, the company that actually owned and operated the rig on BP's behalf, and Halliburton, which had performed cementing work on the well, Both face their own civil and criminal liability on top of BP's costs. That single well control incident is the reason offshore drilling insurance is such a specialized and expensive category, and why every rig owner's finance team has to model a tail risk that dwarfs every other line item on the balance sheet by 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. A rig owner can survive a bad day rate cycle. A rig owner can survive a stacked fleet earning nothing for 18 months. What very few companies can survive without government backing, bankruptcy protection, or an enormous balance sheet like a supermajor's is a genuine blowout. And that risk exists on every single well drilled by every single rig in the fleet, priced into insurance premiums that are themselves a permanent, unavoidable operating cost regardless of whether an incident ever actually occurs. Put the whole picture together into a single worked example. Take a modern deepwater drillship built for roughly $600 million. Under a strong multi-year contract at $400,000 a day and running at 90% utilization. That single vessel generates around $130 million a year in gross day rate revenue, against annual operating costs, crew, logistics, maintenance, insurance, typically running somewhere in the range of $30 to $50 million, depending on the specific vessel and contract terms. On paper, in a strong market, that's an extraordinarily profitable machine, capable of paying back a meaningful share of its own construction cost within just a few contracted years. Now run the downturn scenario. Utilization falls to 60% as contracts lapse and aren't renewed. Day rates for any spot work fall to $250,000 as competitors with idle rigs undercut each other for scarce work. Revenue on that same vessel can fall by more than half, while insurance, hull maintenance, and the debt service on the original construction loan continue almost unchanged. That gap, the difference between what a rig earns in a boom and what the same rig costs to simply keep seaworthy in a bust, is exactly the gap that pushed more than $30 billion of industry debt to the edge of default within a single downturn cycle. So who actually comes out ahead in the offshore drilling economy? It's rarely the owner who ordered a new rig at the top of a boom, financed with debt against optimistic day rate assumptions that assumed the good years would simply continue. It's the owners who kept their fleets young, modern, and in demand enough to survive the lean years without over-leveraging. The national oil companies and supermajors with balance sheets large enough to absorb both a bad cycle and, in the worst case, a genuine catastrophic incident, and increasingly, the restructured post-bankruptcy versions of companies like Seadrill that emerged from Chapter 11, with their debt wiped out and their fleets intact, effectively getting the assets back at a fraction of what they originally cost to build. Could you get rich owning an offshore oil rig? Yes, during the right years, spectacularly. You are not purchasing a simple industrial asset with predictable returns. You are purchasing a multi-hundred-million-dollar bet on a global commodity cycle you don't control, financed against a revenue stream that can have within a single year. Carrying a live-aboard crew you're responsible for around the clock, and sitting on a tail risk that has, at least once, cost a single operator more money than the entire rig fleet of most national industries combined. The steel tower rising out of the ocean is real, and in the right contract, in the right years, it genuinely prints money. But underneath the floodlights and the drilling deck sits a balance sheet built on a number, the day rate, that the owner never controls, and a risk, the blowout, that the owner can insure against but never truly eliminate. In offshore drilling, the fortune and the catastrophe are sitting on the exact same piece of equipment.